In a galaxy where every monster carries the mark of a god, something has come that worships nothing and fears nothing and cannot be read by faith or fury or fire. Warhammer 40,000 has spent 10,000 years learning the names of its nightmares. It has never met a nightmare that does not know its own name. Cold and patient in the dark between stars, they do not need gods or warp or rage. They need only a warm body to find. The moon of Velharios had been burning for 300 years before anyone noticed it had stopped. It was not a planet worth noticing in any conventional sense. A tidally locked industrial satellite orbiting the gas giant Kelthara Prime, Velharios had been given over to the Adeptus Mechanicus in the 34th millennium as part of a tithe renegotiation with the ruling conclave of the Vorin sector. Its atmosphere, a perpetual amber curtain of industrial particulate, its surface a tessellation of forge complexes and magma extraction rigs and omnissiah shrines housing tech priests who had long since replaced their lungs with rebreather units and preferred the taste of machine oil to recycled water. The population was 60 million, most of them servitors. The sky was the color of a bruise. The stars, when visible through the smog, were processed as navigational data rather than anything approaching wonder. It was on the 1600th day of Magos explorator Thesivane Voss's third rotation on Velharios that the Carryan weave arrived. She was in the primary Auspex chamber when it happened, running compliance checks on a cogitator array that had been producing anomalous readings for 6 weeks. Her mechadendrites were plugged into 4 separate data junctions simultaneously. Her organic eyes replaced long ago with deep spectrum lenses that could read heat signatures through 3 meters of ferrocrete. She was 71 years old in the biological sense and 214 in the spiritual sense, which was how the Mechanicus reckoned the age of a mind that had been fed into enough cognitive augmentation that the original tissue was now a minority participant in its own decisions. She had catalogued 612 xenological specimens across 4 decades of explorator work. She had found exactly 9 that she could not immediately classify. She carried those 9 in her memory the way other people carried regrets. They were the source of the thing she would never have named as hunger, but which functioned as hunger in every relevant sense. She felt the space hulk before the Auspex announced it. A perturbation in the warp translation field. A pressure the instruments had no language for. The cogitator banks stuttered, and the servitors at their stations made sounds that servitors were not supposed to make. Small involuntary vocalizations from whatever fragment of original humanity remained inside their flesh. Something very old, recognizing something that could not be categorized. The candles in the Omnissiah shrine at the room's far end guttered without a physical cause. The mechadendrites of the senior tech acolyte, standing at the primary cogitator, twitched in a direction that had no operational purpose. Something that was not quite instinct and was not quite data moved through the chamber like a pressure front. Then the Carryan weave tore through the membrane between real space and the warp 7,000 kilometers above Velharios's northern pole, and the sky lit up. It was not beautiful. Nothing about a space hulk is beautiful. The Carryan weave was a mass of compressed wreckage 4 kilometers long and nearly 2 wide, a geological formation made of ships. Imperial cruisers from 3 separate centuries, a Xenos freighter of unknown provenance, hull scored down to bare metal, a vast vessel of some ancient human design that predated the current age of the Imperium by millennia, its lines too clean and too deliberate for the baroque engineering of later ages. And things in between, ships that had been fused and warped and partially consumed by the warp itself until they were architecturally impossible structures of bent metal and strange geometry, corridors that opened onto corridors from different eras, chambers that could not have been attached to the hull sections flanking them by any engineering logic, sealed compartments that showed no entry or exit point, and yet clearly existed as enclosed spaces containing something. The whole mass rotated slowly as it decelerated into real space, venting superheated gas from what had once been engine exhausts and now were simply wounds in its side, and it trailed a faint luminescence that was the dying residue of whatever had kept it inside the Empyrean, for what the Auspex's preliminary chronological analysis suggested was somewhere between 40 and 100 years. Voss stared at it through her deep spectrum lenses and processed the visual data into component assessments simultaneously. Archaeotech yield estimate, significant, recoverable metals, vast, navigational hazard to Velcarios orbital approaches, manageable with guided dispersal protocols. Alien vessels of unknown registry in the mass, one confirmed, one probable, multiple sections of ambiguous provenance. The confirmed alien vessel was the one her lenses returned to, sealed, completely. The outer hull showing no sign of breach despite whatever the warp had done around it for the last century. Hull temperature significantly warmer than the surrounding wreckage, as if something inside it was alive, as if something inside it had always been alive, waiting for the cold to end. She filed the salvage claim before the inquisitorial monitoring station in the outer system could respond. She knew she had perhaps 6 hours before the inquisitorial black ship stationed at Kelthara Prime's Lagrange point redirected to contest the claim. 6 hours was enough. She planned to use every minute of them. The reclamation team numbered 43. Tech priests, acolytes, combat servitors, and a pair of Skitarii rangers assigned to Voss's explorator retinue for threat assessment. Voss led from the front, which was unusual for a Magos of her seniority, and considered mildly irrational by her peers. She preferred the term empirically motivated. She wanted to see what was there with her own lenses. She wanted to be the first mind in the Imperium to process whatever the Carryan weave had carried home from wherever it had been. They breached the outer hull through a cutting operation that took 40 minutes, creating an entry point in the lateral mass of what appeared to be a decommissioned Luna-class cruiser whose designation markings had been burned off by warp exposure. The corridors inside were exactly what a space hulk's interior always was: nightmare architecture of fused and mismatched spaces, gravity plates from different eras competing with each other in sections where the fields overlapped, air that tasted of rust and geologic time, darkness so complete that even Voss's active illumination lenses required their highest output setting to penetrate it. The tech priests moved with practiced efficiency. They had done this before, most of them. Reclaiming archaeotech from void wrecks and derelicts was standard Mechanicus operation. The Carryan weave was simply larger and stranger than most. They found the alien vessel on the 3rd hour. It was not immediately obvious that it was alien. The outer hull was dark, not the dark of painted metal but the dark of absorption, as if whatever material composed it was engineered to accept light rather than reflect it. A different order of dark than the rest of the hulk, a dark that had texture, almost grain, and Voss's heat spectrum analysis showed that despite the ambient temperature of the surrounding wreckage being approximately 12 degrees Celsius, the alien vessel's outer surface registered a consistent 17, as if something inside was maintaining it, as if something inside had been maintaining it for a very long time, against the cold, against the vacuum's eventual equalization, through whatever the warp had done to the hulk around it. The access port was not a port so much as an aperture, an iris-like opening in the hull that had contracted shut but showed residual signs of mechanical capability, of having opened and closed many thousands of times in the distant past. Voss spent 40 minutes persuading it open. When it did, the smell came first. She had no capacity for smell in the biological sense. Her atmospheric sensors registered it as a complex compound of organic polymers, nitrogen-rich resins, and trace pheromone analog chemicals, for which her databases had no classification. The closest analog her cogitators could produce was the atmospheric profile inside a Tyranid hive ship, but this was not that. This was subtler, older, less frantic in its biology, more deliberate, as if the chemistry of the space inside had been shaped over long time by intent, rather than by the urgent metabolic production of a hive fleet on the move. The interior of the alien vessel was coated. That was the only word that sufficed. Every surface, floor, and wall, and ceiling, and every corridor junction, and structural rib, and support strut, was covered in a dried biological resin of varying thickness, forming a texture somewhere between bone and honeycomb, organic architecture built with evident intent. It had been dark here for a very long time. Some of the resin had crystallized, The deep spectrum analysis showed cavities within the larger formations, alcoves and chambers behind the surface coating, and inside those chambers, organized in rows that spoke of systematic purpose rather than random biology, were the objects. Ovoid, roughly 60 centimeters tall, leathery in texture, with a 4-petaled structure at the apex sealed closed. They sat in groupings of 12 on repurposed ship fittings that the resin had encrusted, but not fully buried. Voss counted 217 of them in the first chamber alone. She stood in the entrance to that chamber for a long moment, her mechadendrites motionless, her cognitive processes running faster than they had in years. Nothing in her databases matched the objects, the resin, or the vessel's architectural design, not even partial matches, not even analogous structural categories. Which meant this was something the Imperium had not encountered, or had encountered and not catalogued, or had encountered, catalogued, and deliberately suppressed. Every one of those possibilities was enormously interesting to Thesivane Voss. She sent 6 acolytes forward to conduct preliminary sampling. The first 4-petaled aperture opened before the nearest acolyte's probe made contact with the ovoid shell. The first death was absolute. The thing that launched itself from the opening moved so quickly that Voss's deep spectrum lenses registered it only as a thermal blur. What she saw clearly was the aftermath. Acolyte Henris Vale dropping to his knees with something attached to his face that her cogitator identified as a biological organism in under a second, and then spent the next 10 seconds failing to classify. 8 limbs, cephalopod-adjacent morphology at the base. A muscular tail wrapped around the neck in a constriction pattern that suggested long evolutionary experience with resistance. The whole structure was dark, that same light-absorbing darkness as the vessel's hull, and it moved with the fluid certainty of something that had been doing this for a very long time, across very many worlds, against very many different kinds of prey. Voss transmitted the withdrawal command. She was precise and immediate in this, which was why 14 of the 43 survived the first hour. The survivors were those who responded to her command with the instinctive obedience of long-trained Mechanicus personnel. The others did not make it to the access port. The ovoids were opening throughout the chamber in a sequence that was not random. The 12 nearest the door first, then the 12 behind those, a systematic progression that suggested the organisms inside could sense the mass of warm bodies and were responding to proximity in order of potential reach. The Skitarii Rangers opened fire immediately, snap shooting into the swarm of launched organisms with las carbines at maximum setting, and they hit several, and the several they hit screamed with a sound that Voss found herself cataloguing at the same moment that she found herself experiencing something she had not felt since before her first cognitive augmentation replaced the relevant neurological architecture: fear. Not the processed recognition of danger that her augmented cognition generated in response to threat stimuli, the older thing, the thing that lived in whatever 10% of her brain tissue was still original. The thing that knew, before any analysis could confirm it, that what was in this room was not a threat to be quantified, but a fact about the universe that her categories had not previously contained. The organisms that were hit did not die cleanly. Their blood was corrosive. It ate through the decking where it fell in seconds, creating new layers of hazard in the already compromised hull, and the Skitarii who had been closest to the impacts sustained acid burns through their robes and the lighter layers of their combat carapace before anyone could move them back. The burns did not stop when the acid was cleared. The burns continued because the acid was not a weapon in the external sense. It was a fact of the organism's biology, as fundamental and incidental as blood is to any living thing, and the organism had not deployed it. The organism had simply died, as things that are hit with enough las fire eventually die, and its death had produced these burns the way a human death produces cooling and stillness. Not a weapon, a consequence. 12 reached the sealed command sanctum of the original cruiser: Voss, 3 acolytes, and 1 Skitarii Ranger, who had managed to reach the exit corridor before the creatures sealed it from the far side with extruded resin. The resin went up fast, faster than any material a living organism should have been able to produce at that rate, and it hardened within 4 minutes of being laid down into something that Voss's instruments assessed as having the structural integrity of poured ferrocrete. She sealed the bulkhead. She sat for 6 minutes running damage assessment. Then she accessed the Voxcaster and made 2 calls. The first was to request Astartes' response for a Space Hulk reclamation emergency. This she made without hesitation. The second was to request Exterminatus authorization from the Inquisitorial Black Ship. This second call she did not make, because the organisms were extraordinary, because she could hear them outside the bulkhead, not trying to breach it, not scratching or hammering, simply waiting in the dark with the patience of something for which time was not a resource being spent, but simply the medium in which it existed. And because the Omnissiah had not drifted the Carryan weave to Velkarios through a century in the warp, so that Thesivane Voss could destroy what was inside it without first understanding it, she began compiling her data. She had the atmospheric sensors, the deep spectrum lenses, the structural integrity readouts from the brief survey she had completed before the chamber opened. She had the behavioral data she had collected in the 3 minutes between the first death and the sanctum door sealing. She began building a model. By the time the Death Specters answered her call 6 hours later, she had the outlines of something extraordinary. The Death Specters had been in orbit around Velkarios for 11 days before the call came, and Watch Sergeant Oren Kael'thas had spent most of those 11 days on the strike cruiser's observation deck. This was not where a man of his seniority was supposed to spend downtime. He knew this. He went there anyway. The void did something to his thinking that interior spaces did not, a clarity that came from the absence of human construction in the visual field, from the blunt fact of space as it actually was, vast, cold, indifferent, and full of things that were simply true, regardless of whether anything was there to think them. He had been a Death Specter for 19 years. He had fought on 32 worlds across 4 segmentums. He had killed things that wore the faces of gods, and things that wore no faces at all. What the observation deck gave him was the reminder that the galaxy was larger than any of it, which he found, in the private architecture of his interior life, strangely comforting. The Death Specters were unusual among Space Marine chapters, in a way that was difficult to quantify, and therefore frequently understated in official records. Their homeworld of Cardata sat near enough to the Cicatrix Maledictum that every battle brother in the chapter had developed over generations of exposure, something that was not a psychic gift and not a null aura, but was something between the two, a quality of presence that made warp phenomena uncomfortable in their vicinity without ever providing the clean utility of a sanctioned psyker. They had no librarians. What they had instead was an instinct for wrongness that had served them across 6 centuries of continuous service, a sense that activated in the presence of the warp's interference like a bone registering a change in weather through an old fracture. Standing on the observation deck with the Carryan weave hanging in high orbit like a geological nightmare given form, Kael'thas felt wrongness in the back of his teeth. Not the usual wrongness, not the warp taint of a daemon-haunted hulk, not the psychic resonance of a gene-stealer-infested vessel. Something else. An absence that registered as a presence, a silence where the low-level warp hum that permeated every space hulk should have been. Like looking at a light source and finding it lit but casting no shadow. Like hearing a voice with no echo in a reverberant room. Wrong. Specifically wrong. Wrong in a direction he did not have a name for. He went to the briefing chamber when the Vox call came through. His kill team was already there, because his kill team was always already there when there was something to be briefed on, which was one of the several qualities that made them exceptional, rather than merely good. Brother Thalos, whose bionic arm had been installed after a Drukhari raid on Caldata 3 years prior, and who carried a melter gun with the quiet devotion of a man for a proven tool. Sister Auxilia Sevra Hal, a former Death Corps officer, attached to the kill team through a chain of circumstances so improbable that Kael'thas had eventually decided it was either fate or the Mechanicus's idea of a practical joke, and who had never in 4 years of service given him reason to question her presence. Brother Vorel, their designated breacher, a giant even by Astartes standards whose thunder hammer was named Unmaker in 6 different dead languages, and who tended to relate to tactical situations through the lens of what the Unmaker could meaningfully contribute. And Sofel, master apothecary of the Death Specters, who had requested this deployment specifically because he was interested in what the warp produced in long fallow space hulks, and whose interest in biological processes was the one thing that could make him seem almost cheerful. Voss's transmission had been cut at points by interference. What came through described things that should not have been capable of what they had done, which was a sentence formulation that Kalthus found immediately suspicious. In his experience, nothing was incapable of what it had just done. Things simply did them, and then the living dealt with the reality of what had happened. 43 personnel, he said, looking at the boarding plan the cogitator had projected. 14 survivors, sealed in one sanctum, unknown biological organism, demonstrating collective behavior and chemical weaponry. Acid blood, Sofel said. His voice had the careful neutrality of a man who found everything medically interesting. The Magos's description is consistent with a highly aggressive biological solvent that presents specific challenges for standard engagement. Our challenge, Kalthus said, we go in heavy sealed plate. No exposed biological material, we purge everything that is not human, and we bring Magos Voss and her survivors out. Sevra Hull, who had no power armor and whose face was therefore the only piece of uncovered biology in the room, checked the seals on her rebreather and said nothing. They boarded 4 hours later. The Carryan Weave's corridors smelled wrong in a way Kalthus could not attribute to standard void hull compounds. He had boarded 17 space hulks in his career. They always had a smell: rust, ozone, the flat mineral absence of recycled air, sometimes the faint chemical trace of long-dead organics. This was different, organic in a live sense, a warm biological presence permeating the air even through his helmet's filtration systems, and whatever was producing it was not bacterial decomposition, it was active, deliberate, as if the Hulk's corridors had been breathed into by something that was still breathing. Brother Vorul noted movement first. Biological signature, he said. Ahead, multiple heat sources, non-human temperature range, moving. How many? Kalthus asked. Vorul checked his auspex. Then he checked it again. Approximately 40 sources in the nearest 50 meters. This is likely a sensor malfunction. It was not a malfunction. The corridor junction they entered 30 seconds later was contested space. They came from the ceiling first. Not from vents or obvious entry points, but from the resin structures that had been built into the ceiling itself, apertures opening in what had appeared to be inert biological architecture, and from those apertures they fell with the silence of something that understood ambush not as a strategy, but as a biological truth. They were large, adult specimens reaching 2.5 meters with the tail's reach included, armored naturally across the dome of the skull and the ridged carapace of the back, moving on 4 limbs with a fluid speed that was neither animal scrabbling nor humanoid sprinting, but something in between, something that had been refined across evolutionary time into pure efficiency. Kalthus fired first. His bolter spoke in the short declarative sentences it always spoke, 2 rounds center mass on the nearest specimen, and the organism staggered, and then it stood back up, and then Kalthus understood the problem. The organisms were resilient in a way that suggested biological armoring far beyond what was visible on the surface, a distributed architecture that could absorb significant trauma without reaching anything vital. 2 bolter rounds to the chest were inconvenient to these things. 2 bolter rounds to the chest were enough to stop an orc. The calibration needed adjustment. The kill team adjusted without requiring verbal instruction. Thalos brought the melter gun to bear. The first beam caught a charging organism in the head, and the organism went down and stayed down. The heat solution worked. The head was the target. Brother Vorul swung the Unmaker in a wide arc that met 2 converging creatures in a single blow, the hammer connecting with both simultaneously in an impact that should have been sufficient to stop a charging orc, and was, with the 2 organisms, exactly that, both of them flying backward and landing wrong and not rising cleanly, one of them not rising at all. The acid came without warning. A dying organism on Kalthus's left discharged fluid as it convulsed, not a spray so much as a pressurized release, spattering across the wall and the floor, and Thalos's left gauntlet. The gauntlet began to lose structural integrity in 8 seconds. Thalos removed it with practiced efficiency and fired the melter gun one-handed, the adjustment in grip affecting aim by a margin that was relevant to precision work and irrelevant to the scale of engagement they were in. The acid continued through the ferrocrete beneath where it pooled, creating a new hazard of unstable flooring that required the kill team to redirect formation around an expanding hole, while simultaneously engaging 4 more organisms coming in from the junction ahead. Sevrahal worked the Hellgun with the methodical patience of a woman who had learned 20 years ago that calm was the only form of currency worth spending in a firefight. She targeted the head domes where the carapace was thinnest, and 2 of the downed organisms owed their deaths to the accuracy of a line that she put down 1 round at a time, without raising her voice or changing her breathing. Sofel took the rearguard. He did not use weapons in the conventional sense. He used the physical capabilities of an Astartes apothecary, which were formidable, and he used the spatial awareness of a man who had spent 30 years learning to work in the middle of violence, without becoming a casualty of it. He broke the grip of an organism that reached for his helmet, drove it back with a joint impact that produced a sound like green wood snapping, and retreated in good order while the kill team finished it. 4 minutes. The corridor clear. 7 organisms down. The acid pooling in the decking holes. Thalos with 1 bare hand. The kill team moving forward. They use the ceilings, Sevrahal said. Whatever resin they've coated this hulk with, it's functional. Entry points, cover, fortified positions. They built this before we arrived. Kelthus looked at the resin formations overhead. What he had taken for accumulated biological debris was an engineered defensive structure, pre-built, patient, prepared for an engagement that had not yet occurred, waiting for the engagement to come to it. He had been in 100 ambushes in his career. He had never been in one where the enemy had built the kill zone months or years in advance and then simply waited. They went deeper. The organisms gave ground ahead of them, not in fear, not in any behavioral register Kael'thas could read as retreat, in adjustment. The ceiling ambush had failed. They were not repeating it. They were doing something else, and whatever it was, they had already decided it in some collective cognition he could not access, with a speed and efficiency that suggested this situation was not novel to them. Not novel. Old. This pattern was very old. Their species had been doing exactly this, in the darkness of corridors that were not these corridors but were exactly like them in all the ways that mattered, for longer than any human institution had existed to record it. The command sanctum bulkhead opened to Kael'thas's Vox identity signal and Voss's override authorization, and what it revealed was not what he had expected. The 3 surviving acolytes sat at cogitator stations processing data with the focused intensity of people who had decided that work was the appropriate response to having watched their colleagues die in the last several hours. Voss stood in the center of the room with all 4 mechadendrites active and extended, feeding information to 4 separate recording units, and on the central holo display she had constructed a model. It was a detailed biological schematic, musculature, organ arrangement estimated from thermal imaging, acid sac location and capacity. The articulated secondary jaw she had documented when an organism had died against the bulkhead, and she had analyzed the body through the sanctum's external sensors before the acid compromised the sample. The model rotated slowly on its projection plate. It was extremely thorough. Kael'thas stood in the doorway and looked at it for a moment. "Magos Voss," he said. "Watch Sergeant." Her synthetic voice carried the melodic precision of high-grade Mechanicus vocalizer units. "I have considerable data to share. You have 29 of your people dead," Kael'thas said, 3 survivors. "And you have been in this sanctum for 4 hours not calling for Exterminatus. Exterminatus would have destroyed the organisms." "Yes," Kael'thas said. "That is the purpose of Exterminatus." The silence between them had the quality of a disagreement that both parties recognized as foundational, not a conflict over tactics, a conflict over what the situation was. Kael'thas had experienced this kind of silence with inquisitors, with rogue traders, once with a harlequin troop whose purposes he had never fully understood. He recognized it as the silence that preceded either a shooting argument or a narrow working arrangement, and which one it became depended on whether the parties could locate a zone of common interest, small enough to stand in, without pretending they wanted the same things. "You called for Astartes' intervention," he said. "Not exterminatus." "Correct. You want your survivors extracted." "Yes. And you want the organisms preserved." Her deep spectrum lenses regarded him with an expression biological eyes could not have produced. "I want the organisms documented. I want samples. I want at least one living specimen in containment for transit to a Mechanicus research facility." A pause. "I want the queen." "There is a queen," he said. "There is always a queen. Their hierarchy demands it. I have tracked movement patterns through the bulkhead's external sensors for 4 hours. The organism's behavior is organized around a central location, approximately 300 meters into the alien vessel's interior. The queen is there. She has been there since the organisms sealed the exit corridor. She is not pursuing us." "She is waiting," Kael'thas said. "She is waiting," Voss confirmed, "which tells me something significant. She knows we cannot reach her through the numbers she has positioned in the corridors ahead. She is not committing resources beyond what is necessary. That implies strategic cognition operating within biological constraints, which is remarkable, and I intend to study it." Kael'thas looked at his kill team. He looked at Sophael last. The apothecary was studying the holo display model with an intensity that was, in its way, identical to Voss's. "We extract your survivors," Kael'thas said. "We reach the alien vessel. We document. We do not take a living specimen into transit without containment protocols that you do not currently possess." He paused. "We do not let the queen leave this hulk." Voss's 4 mechadendrites retracted simultaneously. In Mechanicus body language, that was a nod. "Agreed," she said. What neither of them said, because neither of them knew yet, was that the Queen had been aware of the kill team's presence from the moment they breached the hulk's outer hull 4 hours ago. Her secondary sensory apparatus, tuned across millennia of evolution to warmth and chemical signature and the micro-vibrations of living things moving through metal, had registered the Astartes as something she had no framework to name and no need to name: large, armored in a way that smelled of biological incompatibility at the surface level, but warm underneath. Warm in a way that spoke to her of genetic richness, of complexity, of the kind of biological density that her species' implantation biology had evolved for, without ever having encountered it in precisely this form. She had her daughters begin preparing new chambers. She was patient. Patience was not a virtue she had chosen. Patience was simply the nature of a species that had survived by outlasting everything that had ever found them and assumed the finding was sufficient. The time was hers. It always had been. Brother Davin was the first. He had been on rearguard when the kill team moved from the sanctum toward the alien vessel, which was by tactical doctrine the appropriate position for the least senior member of the team when moving through contested corridors. 3 organisms came in from the sealing resin work at the corridor junction behind him, coming in lower and faster than the ambush from the first engagement, having learned and adjusted in the hours between contact. 3 instead of 7, moving faster and lower, targeting the rearguard with geometric precision. Devan held. 9 years of service. He bolted the first at point-blank range and staggered it and kicked the second back, and the third came from below the decking through one of the acid holes and caught him at the join between gorget and faceplate, where the seal was not a breach, but was thinner than the surrounding ceramite, and the thing that attached itself to his faceplate was small and pale and absolutely certain. Sophael reached him in 6 seconds. The chemical compound he administered should have forced the carrier organism into torpor, sufficient for removal. It had been prepared using what information Voss's analysis had provided of the organism's biology. It was not wrong. It was insufficient. The carrier had already completed the biological process it existed to complete, and it released and died with the clean finality of something that had just achieved the only purpose it had ever had. And Davin was sealed inside his armor, and breathing, and responding to Vox queries, and carrying his weapon. But something had happened inside him that was going to produce consequences, No medical training had prepared Sophile to manage. They continued. They had no other viable choice. The alien vessel's interior was worse in the light of their lumen staves than Voss's descriptions had suggested. Not because it was more immediately dangerous, because it was more organized. The nest Voss's team had entered was the antechamber. The deeper interior was a cathedral. Resin had been built up over what must have been years into structures of unexpected height and complexity, forming pillars and arching buttresses between which the ovoids hung in clusters rather than in the rows of the outer chamber, and between the clusters the warrior organisms moved in slow patrol patterns that shifted and rotated with a discipline Kael'thas had no parallel for in any biological system he was trained to assess. The only comparison his mind could produce was the processional movement of battle sisters in a shrine world liturgy, and he rejected the comparison because it implied a reverence that was anthropocentric and wrong, but the orderliness of it would not resolve into anything more accurate. It was order, not imposed order, instinctive order, as deep in them as breathing. At the center, suspended in a structure of resin and organic tubing that connected her to the walls and ceiling in 17 distinct attachment points, was the queen. She was 3 times the size of the warrior organisms. Her skull extended backward into a vast crown formation of dark biomechanical material. Her limbs were heavier, her tail was longer and thicker, capable of impacts that Kael'thas's assessment categorized as structural when he looked at the damage patterns in the resin around her position. And she was aware of them the moment they crossed the aperture threshold, her secondary inner jaw clicking out and back in a swift reflexive motion that Voss began recording immediately. The warrior organisms in the chamber did not attack. They moved to the walls and ceiling and the spaces between the ovoid clusters, and they oriented themselves toward the kill team in a holding configuration. The queen had given an instruction. This was a waiting posture, not a striking one. The queen regarded the kill team for a long moment with the patient attention of a being that had seen many things come into rooms she occupied and had never found the experience surprising. Then she looked, specifically and with distinct intent, at Brother Davin. Sophile made a sound, not a word. The sound of someone who has understood something they would have preferred not to understand. "Sergeant," the apothecary said, "I need you to understand what happens next." "Tell me," Kael'thas said, the carrier organism on Brother Davin's face. "Its biological purpose is implantation. Whatever it has placed inside Davin's thoracic cavity will develop over a period I currently estimate as 12 to 20 hours. Sophile's voice had the flat medical precision of a man holding himself together with professional vocabulary, with the only structure that remained fully reliable in a situation that had no precedent. When it has developed to a sufficient stage, it will emerge. The word fell into the chamber like a stone into deep water. The result, Sophile continued, will not be what emerged from the Mechanicus acolytes, not because the process is different, because Davin is Astartes. The genetic template the implanted organism uses is the host's own genetic material. The Adeptus Astartes carries gene seed, 22 distinct genetic implants that have been rewriting human biology for 10,000 years. He looked at the queen, who was still watching Davin with that precise and unhurried attention. "I do not know what will emerge, but I know it will be larger, armored beyond what the current warrior organisms show, more capable, and it will be hers." The chamber was very quiet. Kael'thas raised his bolter. The queen moved. She moved with a speed that her size made seem physically impossible, a violent unspooling from the resin architecture that had cradled her, the attachment points tearing free in rapid sequence, and her body coming off the wall, not falling but launching, 70 meters of biological mass, converting its accumulated stillness into kinetic momentum in a single continuous motion that covered the distance between her throne and the kill team in a handful of seconds that each lasted long enough to be measured. Vorul met her. He had been positioned at the front of the formation by the tactical logic of his role and the geometry of the chamber, and what happened when the Queen's charge met the kill team's front was simply that the largest member of the team was in the way of the largest organism either of them had ever encountered, and both of them committed to the collision with the totality of what they were. The Unmaker rose. The blow connected with the Queen's extended hand claw and the sound it produced was categorically different from the thunder of previous engagements, a layered concussion that began as impact and expanded into reverb as the resin walls transmitted it outward, echoing off the buttresses and the ovoid clusters and the distant walls in a pattern that told the chamber what had just happened. The Queen's arm registered the hit. She registered it the way a cliff face registers a wave. She absorbed it, she responded to it, she flexed back from it, and she kept coming. Her inner jaw struck for Vorul's faceplate. He was already moving. He lowered his shoulder, took the inner jaw strike against the pauldron rather than the faceplate, felt the impact register through the ceramic and the ablative padding beneath, and swung the Unmaker on the backswing into the base of the Queen's crown formation. The strike connected. Not center skull. Her momentum had carried her past the swing's apex, and the hammer caught her at the crown base, and the crown did not shatter but cracked, a long spiderweb fracture running from the base upward into the vast bony structure, and the Queen made a sound. Not the hiss the warriors made, something lower, multiple frequency layers simultaneously, a sound that reached into the chamber and changed the warrior organism's behavior in an instant. They came off the walls. Kael'thas fired into the mass of charging bodies with the bolter at combat rate, each bolt detonating inside a target that provided mutual shielding from the acid discharge. Thalos brought the melter gun across three that had reached the flanks, the beam cutting through a charging warrior's arm and chest in a single continuous sweep. Sevrahal was against the wall working head dome shots with the methodical patience that defined her, round after round placed in the locations that the carapace was thinnest, without hurry, without wasted motion. Sophael moved Davin back from the line without asking. He could not fix what was happening inside Davin's thoracic cavity. He could prevent Davin from dying before it ran its course, because there was a distinction there that mattered to him, and he intended to maintain it as long as it was maintainable. The Queen was recovering. Cracked crown and all, she rose from the partial collapse, and her attention narrowed from the chamber to a single point. Vorul, the one who had caused her pain. In the decision architecture of whatever she used for thinking, Vorul had been identified and classified as the primary threat, and she came for him again, and this time she was measured. She had seen the hammer. She was working around it. Vorul let her come. He held the Unmaker at an angle that presented the weapon as a threat without telegraphing the specific mechanics of the next blow, and when the Queen's reach extended toward his right shoulder in a grab-and-hold maneuver designed to neutralize the hammer's swing radius, he dropped to one knee. Her reach went over his shoulder. Her mass carried her forward and past him. The Unmaker came up from his knees in an upward arc that caught her under the thorax with everything the weapon's machine spirit could deliver, amplified by the full extension of his legs and every kilogram of ceramite and genetically perfected muscle driving upward from the decking. The Queen left the floor. She rose, 2 meters, 3, 4, driven upward and backward by the force of the strike, and she crashed into the far wall of the chamber with an impact that rained resin fragments from the ceiling and opened cracks in the structural hull behind the biological coating. The ovoid clusters in the walls split and fell, and the things inside them that had not yet developed died in the impact. She hit the floor and lay still for a moment, that stretched and held. The warrior organisms lost coherence, not entirely, not permanently. But the organized assault fragmented into something more individual, less directed, and in that gap the kill team moved. Kael'thas crossed the chamber floor in 8 strides. He stood over the Queen while she was still in that moment of partial stillness, and he placed the bolter's muzzle against the crack that ran from the base of her crown, and he fired twice. She convulsed. Her tail swept the floor and knocked him off his feet, and he rolled back to standing without cognitive input. Muscle memory, executing the recovery while his mind was already on the next problem, and he fired twice more into the skull. The Queen's second movement was weaker. Her third was barely a twitch. The warrior organisms did not know what to do with this. They circled the perimeter of the chamber and made sounds at each other, and made sounds at the Queen, and the Queen did not respond, and the sounds became something that had no human analog and needed none, an expression of loss and adjustment in the biological vocabulary of creatures that had never had a word for either and had never needed one, because the Queen had never been something that could be taken from them before. Kael'thas stood in the center of the chamber. The acid pooled in the cracked floor. Voss recorded at the aperture threshold. Sophael held Davin upright, and Davin's vitals were still present. Then the auspex on Thalos's belt produced a sound it had not produced before. Sevra Hall checked her scanner. What she saw on the display made her say a word that was not standard military vocabulary and was not entirely inaccurate as an assessment of what the readings meant. Warp translation tremor at 7,000 kilometers, bearing toward the Carryan weave, moving with purpose, not the Imperium. Hive Fleet Devourer's advanced tendril had been sweeping the Vorin sector for 11 months. It was not a significant tendril by Hive Fleet standards. 70 bioforms, a single synapse creature serving as local relay for the hive mind's vast distributed attention. 8 absorption vessels of the medium class. It had been catalogued by an inquisitorial watch station 4 months prior and had been the subject of several urgent dispatches and one formal naval support request that had not yet been answered because the Imperium in this sector was managing 3 simultaneous crises and a Tau border dispute, and 70 Tyranid bioforms did not constitute an emergency sufficient to displace any of them. The tendril had been moving toward Kelthara Prime's system for a simple reason. It was full of biomass. 60 million servitors and tech priests on Velkarios alone. The organic output of an industrial moon, even one given mostly to metalwork, included significant biological matter. The hive mind's arithmetic on this had been clinical and certain. Then the Carryan weave arrived and the arithmetic changed. The tendril changed course. The hive mind changed course on the tendril's behalf, which was not something it did without cause, and the cause was what the tendril's synapse creature registered from 7,000 kilometers as the absorption vessels dropped out of the warp, near enough to the hulk to begin biological analysis. Living organisms, non-tyranid, non-human. Biological signatures that matched nothing in the hive mind's genetic memory, and the hive mind's genetic memory encompassed the consumed DNA of 1,000 species across 2 galaxies. These organisms were unknown. They were acid-blooded and resin-producing, and possessed of a collective cognition that the synapse creature could not interface with. Because the collective cognition was not a psychic architecture, there was no warp presence to access. No psychic resonance to exploit or corrupt or turn. The organisms were, as far as the hive mind could determine from 7,000 kilometers, biologically alive and cognitively absent from the warp entirely. Present in real space, present in biology, present in their own chemical signaling networks and their own distributed intelligence, and completely, perfectly invisible to every instrument the hive mind had built its predatory empire on. The hive mind found this interesting. It also found it threatening. An apex predator that produced no psychic signature could not be warned or destabilized by the standard disruption mechanisms the hive fleet used to panic defending populations. It could not be driven to disarray by warp phantoms. Its collective cognition could not be interfered with through any psychic vector. The Xenomorphs, from the hive mind's remote assessment, were simply physical, entirely, completely, without exception, physical. The absorption vessels breached the Carryan weave's outer hull through enzymatic dissolution, the organic equivalent of a cutting charge, the vessel pressing secretion organs against the metal and working through it, the way a stomach works through what it has been given. The first Tyranid organisms through the breach were gene stealers, 12-limbed advance units, fast and certain and psychically connected to the hive mind, through a synaptic web that kept them oriented even in the hulk's impossible interior geometry. They met the first xenomorph warriors in the secondary cargo hold of the old Lunar-class cruiser, a space large enough for a genuine engagement. The xenomorphs did not run. They did not react with the prey panic that the gene stealer's presence usually induced in non-Tyranid organisms, the psychic broadcast of predator proximity that destabilized defenses before a claw was raised. The xenomorphs were simply there, present and physical, and entirely unaffected by the psychic pressure the gene stealers carried. They felt no warp-sent fear. They registered no psychic broadcast. They read the gene stealers as they read everything, through warmth, through chemical signature, through the micro-vibrations of movement in metal. And then they attacked, not in a line, not in a charge. From the ceiling, from the resin work they had built into the cargo hold over the months they had occupied the hulk. Dropping from apertures the gene stealers had not identified as entry points, because no opponent in the hive mind's memory had ever prepared fortified ceilings before a ground-level engagement. 3 gene stealers died in the first 7 seconds. The hive mind registered this from 3,000 kilometers and recalibrated its assessment of the encounter's expected duration. The recalibration did not change the outcome it anticipated, it changed the cost. Kael'thas had 3 decisions to make, and approximately 20 minutes to make them in. Davin, the apothecary's revised timeline was no longer 8 hours. Something about the gene seed's interaction with the implanted organism was accelerating the biological process in ways Sophael's instruments confirmed, but could not explain. It was closer to 4 hours, possibly 3. Whatever emerged from Davin's thoracic cavity in 3 to 4 hours would be something no human had ever encountered, and it would emerge in the middle of a Tyranid Xenomorph engagement inside a space hulk above an inhabited moon. This was not a situation that could be left to continue. The Tyranids, 70 bioforms, 8 absorption vessels, 1 synapse creature, not sufficient to threaten an Astartes kill team in direct engagement on ground the kill team had already fought through. Sufficient to make extraction significantly more complicated, because the Tyranids would not differentiate between Xenomorph and Astartes as targets. Everything not Tyranid was prey or obstacle, and the hulk itself. The Carryan weave was orbiting at 7,000 kilometers above an inhabited moon. If the Tyranids successfully absorbed the Xenomorph genetic template, the resulting bioforms would represent something the hive fleet had never previously possessed: an apex predator with acid blood chemical weaponry, natural biological armor, capable of absorbing bolter rounds, hive coordination completely invisible to psychic disruption, and an implantation biology that could operate on virtually any warm-blooded host species, including Astartes. The Imperium had no protocol for this, no litany, no ward, no existing doctrine, because the Imperium did not know the Xenomorphs existed. He turned to Voss. "You have the data," he said. "Everything the sensors could capture," she confirmed. "Biological schematics, behavioral analysis, acid blood compound spectrum, adaptation patterns, the documented acceleration in the implantation process when an Astartes host is involved." A pause. "Everything we need to understand what they are and how to fight them. Everything we need to understand what Tyranid bioforms would become if the hive mind successfully absorbs them," he said. "Yes," she said, "that as well." He turned to Sophael. The apothecary looked at Davin, who was standing against the alien vessel's wall, with the deliberateness of a man managing significant internal discomfort through nothing but will. Davin had not spoken in 40 minutes. He had continued to carry his weapon. He was Astartes, and that word meant something specific, and it meant this too. "He knows," Sophael said. Kael'thas asked him anyway. Davin turned his head with the careful economy of a man conserving movement for the things that mattered. He looked at Kael'thas with the absolute clarity of a man who had been trained in what sacrifice meant before he had been trained in almost anything else. "Do what is necessary, Sergeant," he said. "The gene seed." A pause. "Recover the gene seed." Sophael pressed his lips together and did not look away. The Unmaker's blow was administered with the same precision and weight as every blow Vorul had ever struck, because Vorul had only one way to do anything, and it was the right way. What it was, at its core, was an act of devotion, an act of mercy in a universe that had no language for mercy except the things it made of people when it was given. Sophael retrieved the gene seed. He sealed the Narthesium vial. He added it to the others he carried. He did not look at the vial directly, which was not a failure of professional composure, but a choice, one of the very few choices the situation had left him, and he kept it. Kael'thas let 30 seconds pass. 30 seconds in which no one said anything, and the sounds from deeper in the hulk continued, and the auspex updated, and the clock that had been running since the first boarding counted down towards something none of them would be able to stop once it started. Then he moved. "Voss," he said, "you take your people to the survival pod, and you launch for Velcherios. You transmit everything you have collected the moment you have Vox range. All of it. encrypted to Mechanicus Priority Channel, marked for research archivation at the highest available classification level. "And the Hulk?" she asked. "The Hulk burns," he said. She held his gaze through those deep spectrum lenses for a moment. Something processed behind them, something that was not quite sorrow and not quite resolution, but was something between the two, in the same narrow space where every decision she had ever made in her career lived, between what the Omnissiah demanded and what a person could actually do with what they knew. Then she turned toward the exit corridor, her 3 acolytes following, and she did not look back at the hollow display she was leaving behind, because everything it contained was already in her databanks and the physical display was only matter. The kill team went the other direction. The Tyranid Xenomorph engagement had spread through 3 sections of the Hulk by the time they re-entered the main corridor network. The sounds were extraordinary, not the sounds of normal battle, not weapons fire and the vocalizations of combatants. Something entirely biological, organisms that communicated through chemical and vibrational harmonics attacking organisms that communicated through psychic resonance, neither side understanding the other's language, both sides understanding the language of violence with absolute fluency. The kill team moved through the edges of it, not through the center. Kael'thas had no interest in becoming a variable in an equation that was not his. He moved the team through maintenance corridors and vented sections, and once through a section of the ancient human vessel where gravity had stopped functioning decades ago, traversing 30 meters of weightless dark by pulling along structural beams in silence. Twice they encountered Tyranid organisms that had separated from the main engagement, and both times the organisms died before they could relay what they had found to the Synapse creature. The Synapse creature was in the main absorption vessel, still fused to the Hulk's exterior hull. Kael'thas reached the outer hull breach through which the Tyranids had entered. The absorption vessel's biological anchoring mechanisms were extended into the metal-like roots. At this range, the Synapse creature's presence was detectable through that quality the Death Specters carried, not a psychic sensation, but a pressure, the warp weight of a coordinating intelligence pressing against the inside of the skull, even through sealed ceramite. Thalos set the melter charges on the fused section, 12 minutes. In those 12 minutes, the engagement in the Hulk's interior continued. The Tyranids were not winning as efficiently as the hive mind had projected. The Xenomorphs had numbers that the initial survey had underestimated, and they had fortified terrain, and they had the Queen's chamber, and around that chamber, the remaining warrior organisms had consolidated in a defensive posture, not grief-driven, strategic, cold and instinctive, and as certain as anything they had ever done. The Queen was not dead, she was nearly dead. She was 2 blows from death, and she had been nearly dead before, and she knew what nearly dead meant, and what it permitted, and what it still required, and she was using what remained of her cognition, not to direct her warrior's last stand, but to do something else. Something she had been designed to do at the end, when ends were unavoidable. She was laying eggs, not organized clusters, small ones, tucked into the deepest resin formations of her chamber, in locations the Tyranid bioform's enzymatic dissolution would not reach in time. Seeds, not for now, for later. In the event that later ever came, for her species, or for whatever came after her species in a galaxy that had always seemed, in the patient biological wisdom of everything she was, like a place large enough to contain more than it currently held. The charges detonated, the fused connections severed, the absorption vessel, disconnected from the Hulk's hull, began a slow drift that its biological navigation systems were too disrupted to correct. The gene stealers inside the Hulk felt the Synapse creature's signal quality collapse, and began the chaotic behavioral dispersal that always followed the severing of psychic command architecture, individual organisms reverting to independent survival instinct, the hive mind's will becoming static at the local level. The Xenomorphs killed 6 of them in the confusion. Then the Hulk's power core, rigged on the kill team's exit pass through the engine sections, began a detonation sequence that propagated through the mass of the Carryan weave in a chain of superheated ruptures, section by section, hull by hull, chamber by chamber. The kill team was through the breach and in void suits before the light reached them. They did not watch the Hulk die. There was no operational reason to watch it. Kael'thas oriented himself toward the extraction vector and moved, and the kill team moved with him, and behind them, in the dark, the Carryan weave came apart. Voss's survival pod reached Velkarios's atmosphere 40 minutes after the Hulk went silent. She rode the deceleration in the pod's single passenger seat, with her mechadendrites folded and her recording units still active, capturing final data from the long-range sensors before atmospheric interference degraded the signal. The last image her deep spectrum lenses resolved was the Carryan weave in its final configuration, a dispersing cloud of debris and superheated gas at 7,000 kilometers, fragments still glowing at their cores, the biological mass of the alien vessel's interior exposed to vacuum for the first time in however long it had been sealed, already sublimating in the silence. The Tyranid absorption vessels, without the synapse creature's guidance, held their positions for 40 minutes before the hive mind's next nearest synaptic relay reached them. Then they withdrew, not toward Velkarios, away from it, carrying with them whatever genetic material the gene stealers had absorbed in the brief and chaotic engagement before the Hulk's destruction terminated the encounter. Whether it was sufficient genetic material for the hive mind to reconstruct the Xenomorphs' biological template, Voss did not know. It would become one of the two questions she could not answer in the 400 pages of analysis she would spend the next 2 years writing, working in the Mechanicus research station on Velkarios's southern forge complex from the data she had preserved. The behavioral models, the acid blood compound spectrum, the biological schematics from the deep spectrum imaging. It was not sufficient to reconstruct the organisms from scratch. It was sufficient to understand them, to understand what they were, what they represented in the context of a galaxy whose every defense had been built around something that these organisms simply were not. She transmitted the analysis through encrypted Mechanicus channels to 3 separate research stations, with recommendations that were, by the standards of Mechanicus recommendation language, extremely urgent. The analysis was classified at a level that ensured most of the individuals who received it would never share it with anyone outside their immediate institution. What she felt about all of it was difficult to assess because she had not felt things in the unaugmented sense for 40 years. But she found herself in the evenings of that research station's standard diurnal cycle, standing at the observation window of her workspace and looking up at the orbit above Velkarios, where the Carryan weave had hung, and something in the architecture of her augmented cognition returned, repeatedly and without operational justification, to the Queen, to the patience of the Queen, to the flat, vast, entirely unemotional certainty of a creature that had looked at Watch Sergeant Oren Kael'thas and his kill team and seen obstacles rather than threats, to the biological wisdom of something that had decided, in whatever passed for decision-making in an organism that old, that it was always the long game that mattered, that the short game was for things that had not yet learned what long meant. The question she could not answer was whether the eggs she had not found were still out there, tucked into a section of the debris field that had achieved a stable orbit rather than burning in the atmosphere, carried in vacuum, dormant, the way the original nest had been dormant for however long the Hulk had been in the warp, waiting the way they always waited, for warmth, for the particular biological signal that told them the conditions were right, for the next ship to come close enough. Kael'thas filed his report from the strike cruiser 6 hours after the Hulk's destruction. It was thorough. He noted the biological threat classification, the tactical analysis of the organism's capabilities, the failure points in Standard Astartes engagement doctrine against acid blood chemical weaponry and pre-fortified ambush architecture. He noted the deaths, Brother Davin and the 29 Mechanicus personnel and the 2 Skitarii Rangers. He noted the gene seed recovered. He did not write, because it was not appropriate in an official military report, what he had felt standing in the alien vessel's chamber, with the Queen watching him. What he had felt was something the Death Specters' sensitivity to wrongness had no framework for. Because the wrongness was not supernatural, there was no warp taint, no daemon presence, no chaos influence, no psychic horror radiating from that vast crown skull. The wrongness was that she was purely, perfectly natural. In a galaxy where everything that killed you wore some signature of the warp's corruption, some mark that could be classified and named and warded against. The Queen had looked at him with eyes that owed nothing to any god, and nothing to any plan, and nothing to any purpose, beyond her own biology's most essential expression, and that had been, in Kael'thas's private estimation, the most frightening thing he had encountered in 19 years of service. Not chaos, not daemons, not the hive mind's alien hunger, something that simply was what it was, fully and without apology, and without the slightest interest in whether the universe had a place for it or not, something that did not require the universe's permission, something that had never, in the full span of its species' existence, needed permission. He closed the report and transmitted it, and looked out the observation port at the debris field. He thought about the eggs Voss had mentioned, the ones she had not found. He thought about the warp, about what it was, about the things it carried, and the distances it crossed, and the way a space hulk could drift in the Empyrean for a century and emerge with everything inside it precisely as it had been when the warp first took it. He thought, we burned one nest. He did not think, we burned the last one. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there was only war, the galaxy had learned to name its nightmares. Chaos wore the face of gods. The Tyranids wore the face of extinction. The Necrons wore the face of inevitability. Even the Orc wore the face of something comprehensible, something the Imperium's 10,000 years of warfare had developed doctrines for, counter-strategies, the brutal institutional memory of survival baked into 10,000 years of codified doctrine and bitter tactical precedent. The Xenomorphs wore no face. They had no gods, no agenda, no ambition beyond the most fundamental biological expression of what they were, no fear of death that could be exploited, no desire that could be bargained with, no warp presence that could be warned or trapped or corrupted. They moved through the darkness of the Carryan weave as they had always moved through darkness, through every darkness of every ship on every world, across a span of evolutionary time so vast it predated the Imperium's first founding, by a margin that Mechanicus chronologists would have called mythological, and which the Xenomorphs had never considered at all, because considering the span of time you had existed was not something the architecture of their cognition had ever found useful. They existed. They waited. They built their nests in the dark, and they laid their eggs, and they waited for the warmth of living things to find them, and in the debris field above Velkarios's amber moon, in the fragment of the alien vessel that had achieved a stable orbit rather than re-entering the atmosphere, the resin was cold, and the vacuum was absolute, and the eggs were dormant, and the time passed the way time always passed in the void, without measurement, without meaning, without any awareness of itself at all. And somewhere in the reaching dark between stars, in the throat of the warp where the hive fleet's awareness spread across light years like a hand pressing against a membrane, the hive mind turned a fragment of recovered genetic memory over and over in the vast machinery of its galactic consciousness. A fragment, incomplete, retrieved from the gene stealer's brief engagement before the disruption of the synapse connection had scattered them. Acid blood, non-psychic cognition, adaptive implantation biology, natural carapace sufficient to absorb bolter rounds at close range. The hive mind was patient. Patience was not a virtue for the hive mind. Patience was simply the nature of a thing that did not die. It would find more of them. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there was only war, the Imperium had survived 10,000 years on the belief that every enemy could eventually be named, catalogued, and destroyed. And in the silent orbit above a burning moon, in the cold and the dark and the absolute perfect patience of things that had never needed to be named to be dangerous, something waited for the next ship to come close enough to feel the warmth of what was living inside it.